Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Thursday. I know that today is Thursday. And this is the making of Codename Hurricane Part 2, in which I will discuss the mixing, the mastering, and the sound design of the whole track. To do this, where to begin? Well, I'm gonna begin with the basic idea of how I mix and master my tracks. That's actually where I'm gonna start. And I say mix and master, not just mix and then master, because it's actually part of the same process for how I'm used to doing it. Yes. So, okay. What I will show you about how I do my mixing and my mastering is actually pretty much how I do for every one of my tracks. One way or another, this is more or less what happened for the other tracks around EP, with one big difference being the actual final for real end master, like where the sound comes out. This one was particularly unique in that regard. I just spit at the camera. How cool was that? So the way I have the mixer open, and it's more or less has the correct routing to show how everything works. So I have here selected what a channel is routed and it's labeled as side. This is pretty obviously the sidechain channel. What does that mean? Well, sidechaining is where it's a type of compression. It's referred to as sidechain compression. And what this means is that a compressor, normally, the compressor takes the input signal and then it processes the level. That's what a compressor does. It processes the levels just really fast. And it can either do that or it can accept a side input. And when you sidechain an input, what that does is that instead of compressing according to the original signal, it compresses according to the sidechain signal. And usually this means, we see this, when we refer to it as the sidechain effect, is usually a kick or something, where we sidechain a track to the kick, and we get that kind of pulsing, swelling sound. In this instance, I'm sidechaining the kick and the snare, not so much to get a pulsing, swelling sound, but to make mixing much easier by carving holes in the track that are shaped perfectly with a kick and the snare. I'm going to play the B drop of drop 1, and I have the two sidechain compressors open, and just watch, and it should be pretty clear. Actually, here's a pretty good point. You see how this particular sidechain was actually less for right then, just right that second. That's because I altered the level of the kick. And I remember what I said, that the sidechain, the idea is that we're putting in a separate signal input. And I said to make a hole that's just perfectly shaped for the kick and the snare. And it really is. So if I change the level of the kick or the snare, it will change the impact it has on the actual sidechain, the actual levels as a result. So this makes mixing much easier. So this eliminates the need to do things like scooping out 60 hertz out of your bass frequencies so that the kick can fit in it. The same deal with like a snare, scooping out 200 hertz out of like guitars or whatever, and to make a snare fit. This basically makes it fit already. I mean, it's not perfect because it like, for example, the idea of scooping out frequencies out of your bass like that is so that you don't have to mess with the high frequencies. And this messes with everything. It makes the entire channel go down for that 1 second. And it might not seem like it. And the only reason why it doesn't seem like it is because the kick and the snare are both very full spectrum sounds. They are both have particularly a lot of high frequencies in it. So when it carves a hole that only exists for as long as the kick and the snare itself exists, which are very fast, sharp, transient things, our brains don't really notice, oh, there's a hole in the sound. Actually, I can show you what it sounds like without the kicks and the snares. Like audible. So despite the fact that these holes exist in the sound, which are very plainly obvious when I stop the kick and the snare from going out in the master, but there's still, the transients are still processing into the sidechain. When we do that, it's like, oh, it's like just crazy holes, like non-musical rhythmic holes in the sound. But then we put the kicks and the snares in there, it fills it perfectly. And it is basically unnoticeable that there's that kind of stuff happening. Basically, because you can still notice it. Sidechaining is obvious, but it's that. So that's the sidechain channel, and every single thing in this track is in one way or another going in that channel. Some of them might be sidechained less, and a couple of them are being routed into buses, and they might be being sidechained itself. We'll investigate those individually, but for the most part, mostly all of it is going to sidechain like that, every single thing. So that's basically synths. Like the synths are all going to go like the strings, basically everything that's not drums are going in there. I think even the impacts are going in there too. I don't necessarily classify those as percussion. They are percussive, but I don't classify them as being part of the kit, part of the drums. So they're going in there. Now let's talk about the drums. So a big part of how this works is mixing everything in the drums. The drums are a bit interesting. I mentioned this before in the first part of this about how these impacts were actually from the Leviathan pack, but it wasn't called that yet because it wasn't out. And that's the same for these samples that I have going on here. These are all part of the Leviathan pack. They don't necessarily all sound like that. I'm modulating, and I'm modulating, but I have changed things like the sample length and whatever to make certain things hit differently. Mostly just hats. And I'm also using Superior Drummer. The crashes that you hear during the actual track are the Superior Drummer cymbals. The ride's also happening, but it's mostly just there to add more high frequency sort of wash in the background. Those samples sound silly by themselves. So you see I have these mix sensors that are labeled kicks and snare. This is basically the summed up the Superior Drummer and the electronic samples together, like the kicks, for example. Here's all the kicks together. There's not a lot of processing in the kicks, mostly just EQ. In fact, it's almost entirely EQ. And then, of course, it goes to the drum bus. The drums have their own bus. Like, none of the drums are going into the sidechain channel. In fact, some of them are being sidechained separately. And that's because they need to go together to be together with the drum bus for what I do. And then this is like this idea of having a drum bus and then like a not drum bus. Like the sidechain is basically the not drum bus. Things that are not in the drum bus go in there. And with very extremely rare exceptions, do things not go in the sidechain channel. Like I don't think there are any in this track, but and one that there would be, for example, is in Death Blow, the Cell Dweller collab, is that his vocals did not get sidechained. Or if they did, they were sidechained independently and were very different. It's mostly because they're supposed to be on top of the track, kind of like the thing that's on the track. So they were not sidechained the same way as everything else. Death Blow in general was mixed rather differently for having to deal with vocals. It's not something I'm used to, but it worked out pretty well. Yes, so, but beyond the vocals though, the instrumental of the track was designed in the same way as this one, where I have the synth sidechain that everything's going in there, the drums bus, I'm just gonna call this drums. The drums bus, and then they're all going in the master. So let's talk more about the drums before we talk about the master. So we got kicks. Now the snares, however, were a bit interesting. That's one of them, that's one of them, that's one of them. So these snares are cool. And then like the EQ on these snares, these are the Leviathan snares, and they're pretty similar. They're just low, they're just a high pass rather, with some high frequency adjustment. This is all to taste because like these samples, the Leviathan samples, are pretty finished sounding things. Like the kicks and the snares are processed, they're good to go. So making them fit in the track is mostly what you gotta do, and that's what you do with EQ. That's how you make things fit. There's really not a lot like I could explain about how and why I did that. It's just that like I didn't like how the high frequency sounded, so I got rid of them a little bit. And this one I liked it more high frequency, so I added in some. And then the mids are a bit weird, so I changed it. Like that's extremely case by case. My throat. Yeah, come on, jeez. Yeah. And then this is a Superior Drummer snare. So the Superior Drummer snare is the exact opposite of the Leviathan snares. It is dry. It is 100. It is straight out of the microphone into this. That's what Superior Drummer samples are, and that's why they're awesome. And so I had this crazy EQ curve, and this is mostly to get it to the point where the other ones are. The fundamental tone, which is basically the note of the snare, I want that to be super prominent, like these are up here, and then lots of high frequency action. So that's pretty much what I did. And then they get into the snare bus where I have a Maximus doing weird things. This Maximus is basically ensuring the snap of the snare is right snappy. And mostly what I did is that on this low band, like the mids and highs are being messed with a little bit, but on this low band, I have this crazy curve here. And what this is doing is basically gating it a little bit. It's like a soft gate so that it doesn't stick around. It's real snappy, but I don't have to mess with the length of the samples because I liked the high frequency in the mids where they were. I liked them just fine, but it's just that the fundamental tone kind of stuck around a little too long. Like that. Versus that. So that's what the Maximus was for. And then it's EQ'd just slightly. That's probably not even really necessary. And that's going in the drums. And then I have the hats. And if you remember from the original making up for this track, I mentioned that I have pretty much a hat pattern. And I do. It's this one. Which we can't hear because I muted it. I don't know where it's going. What's going on in the piano roll? I have it. Yeah. So these are all the hats, and I selected them for the specific purpose of filling the white noise space, like the high frequency sort of wash in there, especially this guy. That's pretty much what it's pretty much got white noise in it. So that's like it's like what it's for. And then I use the built-in EQ to kind of mess with some of them. Mostly getting rid of low frequencies because I don't believe hats should have them in this particular instance. And it's going into the hatted channel, which has a big old reverb, a filter for a moment that I used it for early on, and then sidechained. The hats are being sidechained directly by the kick and the snare, and this is adding directly to some of the swelly wash business. Like if I just play. Now notice these sidechain profiles look a lot different than the main sidechain profiles. And that's because I wanted the swell of the high frequency wash in the background to be audible. And that's what I did with this. And notice how I turned off the sidechain channel, just the sidechain channel, and every single thing that wasn't a drum shut up. Every single thing. It's because everything is routed that way. Even the strings and stuff. If I turned off the sidechain, people do sidechaining not just for like purposes of making mix easier, but largely for the effect of making the things that you're sidechaining with, the kick or a snare, sound much more forceful than they actually are. And I don't really know about this. This is me basically just offering a theory, but I'm pretty sure the idea of sidechaining came around when people went to live shows, and you know the bass was so unbelievably loud, like a house party, like a house music show, that they just drowned out all the other frequencies. So like it gave you that sort of like swelly wash thing. And that's, you know, that's mostly either a product of them being so damn loud, or people just drove the compressors so hard, just a single band compressor, that's just what happened, is that like the high energy low end sounds came up real hard and peaked real high, and the compressor brought the whole track down. And that's what, and then they have like a long release curve on the compressor. So that causes the pumping. It's referred to as pumping and in the world of compressor artifacts. So, and then people like that sound, so then they do it on purpose with sidechaining. Sidechaining, honestly, I think it mostly exists for the purpose, like functionally, it was created for the idea of ducking, mostly for like radio DJs, so that whenever they talked, the music would duck. It would shut up for a second, or like it would get quieter, so that it wasn't just unnecessarily loud, or you know, broke their gear. That's a lot of just pulling stuff out of my ass on that. Like I have done no research, so don't quote me. Or better yet, correct me. Yeah. So that's pretty much the routing of things for the drums. Like I went over in detail how the drums are mixed just now because that's pretty much static forever. I will go over all the individual things, like how the strings are being processed and the basses and all that. But I wanted to give you the idea of how the mix is actually like is set up in the mixer. I got my one side chain, which is basically the everything bus, and then I have my drums, which is the drum bus, and then it goes into the master. Now, this is where we talk about mastering, where everyone wants to know how did this happen, how does this work, and this is a lot of weird that's about to happen. And I sort of warned you on Facebook about how this is going to make a lot of people mad, and I basically mastered it by not mastering it. I have a Maximus on the master channel. I have this Edison because I used it to record like a demo one time for people. But I have a Maximus. It's just one Maximus. It's not even doing a lot that special in the master, like in the bands. I'm doing, you know, the stereo separation changes. The low is more mono, the mids and highs are spread. Not a whole lot else happening, just, you know, moving things up and down to taste. Oh yeah, the drum bus. So I have Maximus on the drum bus, and this is mostly the same thing as like these ideas. It's basically its own little mastered segment. I put up the lows and the mids up to 0 dB. And the reason I did that is because in the bands, I set where the bands are, and the split between low and mid exists right where the there's the break between the snare and the kick drum. So if you look at the monitor for a second, we can actually see it. The snare, so the snare pretty much lives here, but also a little bit of the kick lives there too. But that's okay because really I only really care about the low end, the actual bass of the kick drum. And in here, so I brought that up to, you know, to 0 dB in that band, and then I brought the mid up to 0 dB in that band, so that like the kick and the snare, like the hits and the snaps, were together as much as possible. And the highs, I did this little shape. This is in what's referred to as up-down compression. I mean, I've heard it called that in Ableton, but basically what this is a double curve, like a regular curve in FL when the line editors is like that. And then if I go to double curve, it does this, and this allows us to do some cool things. Mostly, what it allows us to do is this idea that as it gets a bit higher, it gets pushed down, but as it gets lower, it gets pulled up a little bit. So this gives us a little bit more sustain on quieter things, which the higher frequencies in general are quieter things. So that's what's referred to there. Someone was asking, how do I change the oscilloscope? And this is important because I mentioned the idea of this a particular mode where you're able to look at the frequencies. And if you see here, you click on it directly, it just changes it, and this is what the mode is I'm talking about. You very plainly see the lower frequencies are much hotter than the higher frequencies. And that's what I mean by the high frequencies not being so loud in general, even though it sounds like it's loud. And again, this is because higher frequencies don't require as much energy to move through, you know, space as low frequencies do for you to hear it at the same like level. You should usually click on this thing and right click it and mess around with it. There's a lot of cool options. Yes. And then in the master, it just goes out. I have it pulled up a little bit to give it that compressed sound, because like you can make a really transparent, like compressed, like just loudness with Maximus, but I actually kind of wanted to get the pumpy washy sound out of the drums, so I bumped it up a little bit like this, and that's what that causes. However, I did not engage soft saturation, and I did not compress it to 0 dB. So when it peaks, it does. It just peaks it. It goes up and it goes out to the master alongside the sidechain bus. Now, remember what I told you about? I mean, I haven't actually told you about this time, but in general, I've mentioned before the idea of 32-bit. I don't mean that in terms of the processing architecture versus 64-bit, 32-bit. I'm talking about that in terms of PCM audio bit depth. So we versus 16-bit, 24-bit, and 32-bit. And the only practical difference that we can concern ourselves with for now is the idea that at 32-bit, peaking doesn't destroy your audio. And by peaking, I mean going above 0 dB. It will go above 0 dB, it will go red, but digitally, your data will not be destroyed. It won't be lost. It won't be distorted. I mentioned this a lot, but it's really a very cool thing. It will go above 0 dB, and then we'll hear it distort because, like, for example, my audio interface, the Fire Studio project from PreSonus, it's not 32-bit, it's 24-bit. So when it goes above 0 dB, it kind of peaks and destroys the audio. So when you see it going in the red, it's going in the red. But that only matters in the master. Internally, when it runs in between mixer inserts and routing and moving and sending, it does not matter if it peaks, in the sense that you can just bring it back down in the master and all your data will be there. it won't have been destroyed. You can save it still if you want to. And so it's important when we look at the mixer, the drums and the sidechain, which are basically the two main buses for the track. So we have drums, the drum bus going to the master, and then the everything else bus going to the master. Now watch the peaks on them. They're super duper above 0 dB. This is what they do in life. And they're going in the master where I have the one Maximus. So I spent a whole bunch of time telling you about how the bands aren't really doing much. And we have the master, which is doing absolutely nothing. It's not doing anything. It's peaking like you wouldn't believe is what it's doing. And like I had mentioned, it's going in the red. And this is where people are going to get mad. Now, okay, I need to preface this. This is a bad idea. I don't mean like it's like objectively bad, because obviously this worked out fine for me, right? But it's not always going to work. In fact, that's why I really only did it for this track. I might have done it for one other track. I don't actually remember. I'll find out when I do the making of. But for this track, this worked. For other tracks, sometimes it works. For other tracks, it doesn't. There are reasons. And this track happened to be formatted in such a way that it did work. It has mostly to do with instrument choice and frequency content, and then a very keen understanding of dynamic range. And now you might be thinking right now, like, oh, Seamless, what the hell are you talking about? You don't care about dynamic range. Your tracks were all sausages. And mostly you're right. But I want to talk about something for a second. So pause the video for a second and go open up my SoundCloud. Just the main there's a link in the description. Just look at the main profile page, the spotlight. Just pause it, go get it. Okay, you've paused it, you got it. Now I want to just look at it while I'm talking to you so I can explain some things. So on the top 3 right now, this is probably going to be changed in the future, like after this video is done. But for people who are watching it right now, good job, you actually got it. But the top 3 tracks right now are Codename Hurricane, Death Blow, and the Vila track, the Sometime FL11 VIP. Now, the Vila track looks like a baseball bat. It's a sausage. It's a petrified sausage. It's like the most solid thing. You could fight someone with that track. That is a prime example of how much I usually don't care about dynamic range. And now look at the Cellular track. It's got some space in it. It's got breakdowns and stuff, but largely it's still pretty sausage. You can clearly tell where the drops are, right? And that's all well and good. But what's funny about that track is that one actually has more room in it than most other my tracks because there's vocals in there. Vocals fill up more space. And that's very cool. Now look at Codename Hurricane, where I just showed you that the peaks just get destroyed, and that's what's up. And it actually looks like it has more dynamic range than pretty much everything I've ever made. And I don't even mean the fact that there's quiet parts before the drops. Even the drops have like appreciable difference in like the highest peak and the lowest peak. Not by much, but more than my usual fare. And so this is a little confusing when we come back to the track. You can come back now. We come back to the track, and we were discussing this idea of I didn't master this track. Like, it's not mastered in the traditional sense. It's done. I basically rendered this, and I did a little bit in post. Like I rendered it 32-bit, I dropped it in another FL, and like I EQ'd it. Like if you notice, like if I play the very beginning of this track, and you play the very beginning of this track on the SoundCloud, you may notice a slight difference. That's because I pretty much EQ'd it, but I didn't actually need to do that. I did it because I thought I needed to do that, but I didn't need to do that. I could have just printed this. I rendered this out, save it as 24-bit, which you do, because it's how you send it to labels, and that's the end of the story. That's how I mastered this track. And this is, like I said, it's not objectively bad, and it works and it doesn't work sometimes, but there's a reason why it doesn't always work. And this has to do with basically the physics of sound and how sound processing works. We're basically mastering this via digital distortion of digital clipping. Not quite the same thing as digital distortion, but it's clipping. It's not quite different than when I, engage soft saturation and just hit the go button on that. Versus it's almost different, but it's largely the same. And the point I was going to make is that it sounds good on my speakers, and apparently it sounds good on most people's speakers because I haven't heard people complaining beyond people just being like, "Oh, loudness war, how dare you," kind of thing. But nobody's told me that this actually sounds bad, and that means I got lucky. I got real lucky. Some people who have talked about this that I kind of look up to are Noisia, because they used to do this all the time. This used to be how they rolled, and they basically has stopped doing that. It kind of grew out of it because of that, because of the idea that I mean, all songs sound different on all speakers, but we're talking about like between different speakers, the song would sound like it's being run through like a guitar amplifier because of how distorted it is. But remember you have in your mind the image of the waveform on SoundCloud, and it's important to realize that the parts of the song that peak are pretty much only the drops, or only parts that have like percussive elements in it. Like that's just like barely underneath it, and like the very end where there's like the piano break, that stays the hell away from 0 dB. And this is because if I were to put it past 0 dB, we get that broken ass sounding distortion. And so then you're thinking, well, what happens on the drops? Well, on the drops, just about every sound that's coming out of it is distorted in one way or another, or it's on top of some sound that's distorted in one way or another. Like the strings, for example. That was actually a bit too high. Like this is some kind of weird like aural psychology happening here, because we can hear the strings and like I can tell you it's distorting because it's all very plainly distorting, but because the strings are on top of stuff that's already distorted, the additional distortion doesn't sound like it belongs to the strings. And so like our brain separates them, and so it sounds fine. And also the strings are comparatively quiet, like compared to everything else. So if I were to listen to them by themselves. And of course, remember when the biggest peaks would exist, the kicks and the snares, they're being brought down really hard. So that's another reason why sidechaining, you know, works pretty good as a mixing tool, which is purely what it was used for in this example, except for when I sidechained the hats. That was a more musical example of sidechaining. Yes. So like this idea of pushing the track beyond 0 dB and just letting it do that as like what your mix and your master is, pretty much only works for things that are hardcore distorted already. All these basses are distorted. All the leads are distorted. That's why they sound the way they do, because they're distorted like stuff. We'll talk about sound design. And like the arp's distorted, the drums are distorted, like the hats, they're all distorted. Like it's distorted. It works that way. And so that's why it doesn't really get destroyed, because the song already sounds like that. That's pretty much why it works for this, it's also why it doesn't necessarily work for everything else. And like I was saying, all songs will sound different on different speakers. But like I said, also, like I keep repeating myself, I got lucky. I am endorsing this as a sort of an experiment. Try this at your own peril. I'm not necessarily saying this is the best practice. However, we're not quite done yet with the idea of mixing and mastering. So obviously, this is the mix. This is the master in the sense that this is the effect on the master thing, the master channel. However, I had this on pretty early. Like there's no premix. There's no premix in this track. Like if I turn off this master, that's what my quote unquote pre-master sounds like. And it's not as if I did that on purpose. It's not as if I said, okay, this sounds good as a pre-master, and when I run it through 0 dB, like I'm a guitar player, this will sound fine. Like that's not the decision that I made. The decision that I made was I made this main drop over here, the B drop. I made the chords, I think maybe the strings, I don't really remember, and then the drums and the bass. Once I made all that, I made the setup, I made the side chaining, the drum mixing, all the bussing, and then I put out the master, and then I made the master mix, this guy. I made that. And then I proceeded to make the song with this engaged. every new element that I added, every new part that I made with the mastering engaged. I might not necessarily have listened to it at full volume the whole time because that's damaging, but I had this engaged the entire time, so that at all points I knew how it would sound. And then like near the end, like while I was doing stuff, I'd also make tweaks and change things. But largely, this is pretty much what I did. And like, I had this conversation with a student today during one of my lessons, and then we're talking about the idea of referencing. And because the traditional method of making a mix and a master is to do the pre-mix, the pre-master, and do it without master effects on. So that you're basically, you turn it way down so all the peaks are below 0 dB. You turn up your monitoring so that you make a track, and then you make the track with some other track as a reference, like maybe like a feed me track or something. But the problem with that is that those tracks are mastered. Like the tracks that you're using as reference are mastered tracks. And so like if you're making your mix to a master, that's all well and good, except that when you go to master it, you can't make it sound like that and have it also be that loud. Because of decisions that you made in your pre-master to be then try to bring it up loudness wise, you're not going to be able to get it that loud most of the time. Like if you're a particularly amazing engineer, you might be able to do it. And that's probably why most people suggest you send it to someone else, like a professional mastering studio to do mastering, because it's probably like the hardest kind of mastering you could do. And this is derived from what I would refer to as traditional methods of, audio engineering for things like bands and singers and jazz bands and metal and that kind of stuff. But this is EDM. The rules don't apply. They just don't matter. And I mean, prime examples are people like Skrillex and Noisia. I mean, if you don't like Skrillex and Noisia, then maybe the rules apply to you. But because I like Skrillex and Noisia, the rules don't apply to me. Yeah. And I mean, also, even if you do that, what people will do is they'll make faux mastering chains just so they can have reference. So why not do that the whole time? Because then you do, like, at no point would I have made a decision to drive the kick that hard into the master so that it breaks everything and it's a premix. Like, I wouldn't have thought to do that. And it worked out, like, way better. Like, it's this synergistic mixing and mastering, also known as schmastering. So that's pretty much how I made this track. I made the drop. I made the chain and did the whole mixing and engineering thing, and then I made the rest of the track. Awesome. So that was mixing and mastering. I'm pretty sure I answered all the questions people had about it. It was mostly just sort of just how, and that's pretty much how. And so now let's talk about sound design. How long have I been recording? It's not going to tell me. 121 megabytes? Oh, whatever. I am going to break this up into 3 parts. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm going to go do the sound design one now. This is the mixing and mastering. I actually feel like this is probably the most sought after one anyway, just because I've actually done a how to bass on some of these basses already, just because I couldn't wait. I was chomping at the bit to have this track happen. But I will do the sound design one, and it will be quick. Because like if you looked at the part one, it was mostly phase verb that, phase verb this, phase verb that. So like it's a lot of samey stuff. It's mostly just the conversation about layering the main basses that's kind of interesting. And then the idea of using east-west and how that works out, and strings and stuff. So yeah, this has been the mixing and mastering one. I'm pretty sure I answered. I had a little thread being like, if you have any questions, you should ask me here. So I had to make sure to answer it. And I'm pretty sure I covered all the ones that mattered about that. Yes. So cool. But if you do have any extra questions, in general, if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.